The first sound wasn't the insult. It was the silence that came after. A thick, syrupy quiet that coated the room when my daughter Clara looked at me, then at her friends, and let a slow smile spread across her face. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, the one I hadn't seen since she was a teenager, planning some secret act of rebellion. She held up her glass of iced tea, the condensation beating on the crystal I'd bought her for this very house, and said the words that fractured something deep inside me. "Don't mind my mom," she laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "She's just a retired bum. She doesn't get how the real world works anymore." Her friends, Anna and Leo, chuckled along, their polite, sharp little noises filling the space her words had emptied. They looked at me sitting there on the patio chair I'd assembled myself, and their eyes were filled with a placid, dismissive pity. But the worst part wasn't their judgment. It was the clear, bright pride in my own daughter's face as she sold me out for a moment of cheap social currency. How does a mother's love curdle into something a child is ashamed of? Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. The afternoon sun was warm on my skin, but a chill had settled in my bones that had nothing to do with the weather. I could see every detail with a painful sudden clarity. The perfect manicured lawn of the backyard, a green so vivid it looked fake. The way Anna's designer handbag sat on the stone patio table like a small leather trophy. The carefully curated disinterest on Leo's face as he scrolled through his phone, only looking up to nod in agreement with Clara. My daughter had built this perfect life, a stage for her success. And I was suddenly an embarrassing prop she'd forgotten to put away. I had retired 5 years ago, not because I was tired or obsolete, but because I'd earned it. I had built an empire from nothing, from late nights fueled by cheap coffee and a desperation to give Clara a life I never had. A life where she could have friends like these in a house like this. I had named the company after her, a secret I kept coiled in my heart, Innovate. It was a promise, a legacy. And here she was, an executive in my own company, describing me as a relic who didn't understand the world I had fundamentally built for her. We've all felt that sting of being misunderstood, but this was different. This was erasure. Have you ever poured everything into someone only to see them throw it back in your face? I stayed quiet, letting their conversation flow around me. They talked about work, about the pressures of their latest project at Innovate. They complained about the board of directors, about the out-of-touch old guard who founded the company, people they'd never met, but felt comfortable scorning. They spoke of the company as a machine they were mastering with no thought for the hands that had designed and assembled the engine. I just listened, my hands resting in my lap, the skin on my knuckles rough from a morning spent in my garden. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a scene from a movie where the main character was about to learn a terrible truth. Clara, sensing my silence wasn't admiration, but something else, turned to me again. Her voice was softer now, but laced with a condescending edge that was somehow worse than the open mockery. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said, her friends watching me, judging my reaction. "We're just talking about work stuff. It's probably really boring for you." She then leaned in, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, and delivered the line that sealed her fate. That sealed all of their fates. "Honestly, it's for the best you stay out of it. You wouldn't last a day at a place like Innovate. You just don't have what it takes anymore." I remember the sound of her laughter when she was 6. A bright bubbling cascade of notes that filled the backyard of our tiny first house. It was the sound of the rusty swing set chains groaning as I pushed her higher, her small hands gripping tight, her face tilted back to the sky. "Higher, Mommy. Higher," she would shriek, and that pure, unfiltered joy was the fuel I ran on for years. That sound was a ghost now, replaced by the hollow, polite laughter from the patio. It was the sound of performance, of a transaction. After she told me I wouldn't last a day at Innovate, a heavy silence fell between us. The sounds that filled it were agonizingly small. The gentle clink of ice cubes shifting in Anna's glass, the whisper of a breeze through the perfectly pruned rose bushes I'd planted for her, the soft tap of Leo's finger on his phone screen. They had already moved on, leaving me stranded in the wake of her casual cruelty. Then, as if to prove her own point about my usefulness, Clara's face lit up with a synthetic panic. "Oh, I completely forgot," she said, snapping her fingers. She turned to me, her smile a carefully crafted mask of sweetness. "Mom, you're an absolute lifesaver. Could you possibly run up to the study and grab my blue portfolio? It's on the desk. I need to show Anna the final Q3 projections." She didn't ask. Not really. It was a directive wrapped in the thinnest veil of politeness. I was no longer her mother. I was her assistant, her unpaid intern, her bum. Is there a point where a parent stops being a protector and becomes just a utility? I stood up, my joints protesting quietly. I didn't look at her friends. I couldn't bear to see the confirmation in their eyes that this was my new role. As I walked into the cool, quiet house she now owned, a house my money had bought, the weight of my own secret pressed down on me. I had handed my legacy to a daughter who saw me as an inconvenience. The study was immaculate, smelling faintly of leather, an expensive air freshener. On the polished mahogany desk sat the blue portfolio stamped with the silver Innovate logo. My logo. I ran my rough fingertips over the embossed letters. A company I built from a dusty garage with nothing but grit and a vision. A vision for her. I picked it up. It felt impossibly heavy. Filled not just with papers, but with the full weight of her disrespect. When I returned to the patio, the conversation had already resumed. A low murmur of industry jargon and strategic complaints. I held the portfolio out to Clara. She took it without looking up from her laptop, her fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second, a touch devoid of any warmth or recognition. "Thanks," she muttered, her eyes already scanning the first page. Anna and Leo leaned in, their heads close together, and I was once again invisible, a ghost in my own daughter's life. I stood there for a moment too long, a forgotten statue in their garden of ambition, when a sound cut through the air. It was the distinct sharp click of the side gate opening. A young man stepped into the backyard, his face a mixture of confusion and concern that quickly hardened into something else. My son, Alex. He saw it all in a single frozen moment. His sister and her friends huddled over their work and his mother standing beside them, utterly and completely alone. Alex didn't say a word. He just walked over, his eyes locked on mine, and gently took the empty portfolio from my hands, placing it on the table with a quiet finality. There was a metallic taste of betrayal in my mouth. And for a moment, I felt the world tilt on its axis. He had heard, maybe not the exact words, but he had seen the posture of it all, the casual cruelty of the scene. Clara and her friends finally looked up, their perfect corporate bubble pierced by his presence. Alex had my late husband's eyes deep and steady, and when he looked at his sister, they held a profound disappointment that was more damning than any shout. He turned to me and confessed something that changed everything. "I was on the phone with Dad's lawyer an hour ago." "Mom," he said, his voice low and steady, meant only for me, but loud enough for the sudden silence. "He mentioned Clara called him last week. She was asking about the estate, specifically about your shares in Innovate. He said she told him you were thinking of selling them to her." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "She told him it was your idea. Why would she lie about something so fundamental?" My son, my quiet, thoughtful Alex, had always been the observer in the family. He worked with his hands, a master carpenter who found more truth in the grain of a piece of oak than in any boardroom. He had no interest in Innovate, but he had a fierce, protective love for me and for the memory of his father, Richard. Richard always worried that I pushed Clara too hard, that I gave her too much. "We're building her a palace, Rose," he used to say, his hands stained with engine grease. "But are we teaching her how to live in a house?" I'd always dismissed his concerns as old-fashioned. I wanted my daughter to have a sword, not just a shield. Had I loved her so much, I'd forgotten to teach her how to love back. Alex gently placed a hand on my arm, his touch warm and grounding. The roughness of his calluses was a familiar comfort, a stark contrast to the smooth, cold world Clara inhabited. He leaned in closer, his voice a whisper. She's been making calls, strange ones, about the company's founding charter. How can two children raised under the same roof grow into such different people? Clara, sensing a shift in power, stood up. She smoothed down her silk blouse, her face a mask of practiced concern. Alex, what are you doing here? She asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. And what are you whispering to Mom about? You know how easily she gets confused these days. Her friends, Anya and Leo, exchanged a quick, knowing glance. It was a perfectly executed maneuver designed to discredit him and infantilize me in one motion. Alex didn't flinch. I came to check on my mother, he said, his voice level. Something you might want to try sometime. The barb hit its mark. A flicker of anger crossed Clara's face before she quickly composed herself. She walked over, placing a hand on my other arm, her touch feeling like ice compared to Alex's. Her nails were perfectly manicured, a stark white against my sunspot skin. She looked from me to Alex, her smile brittle. We were just having a lovely afternoon, she said, her voice a silken weapon. He's always trying to stir up trouble between us. Don't listen to a word he says. For 30 years, I kept my greatest creation a secret. I built Innovate to be a silent gift. A kingdom I wanted Clara to believe she had conquered on her own merit, not one that was handed to her. I thought it would forge her character, make her strong, independent. I never imagined the strength I gave her would one day be used as a weapon against me. Seeing her stand there, twisting my son's love into a narrative of my supposed silly, I felt a deep, profound regret that tasted like ash in my mouth. My husband Richard's face swam into my vision, not as he was at the end, worn down by sickness, but as he was on the day we signed the first lease for that dusty garage. He was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners, a smudge of grease on his cheek. You're giving her the world, Rosie, he'd said, his voice full of awe and a little bit of fear. Just make sure she remembers how to hold it gently. I had failed his memory. I had failed my daughter. We try to give our children roots and wings, but what happens when their wings carry them so high they forget the ground they came from? I pulled my arm from Clara's grasp. Her touch was an offense, a violation of the memory of the man who had loved us both so fiercely. That's enough, Clara, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It wasn't the voice of a confused old woman. It was the voice that had brokered million-dollar deals. The voice that had stared down bankers and rivals and bent the world to my will. For a second, just a second. She looked startled. Anna and Leo shifted uncomfortably. They had come for a casual Sunday afternoon of networking and iced tea, not a raw family schism. But the moment passed. Clara's confidence, that bright, hard armor she wore, slid back into place. She forced a laugh, a sound that was painfully sharp. See, this is what I mean, she said to her friends, gesturing towards me as if I were a misbehaving pet. She gets these moods. It's best if we just get her inside where she can rest. She reached for me again, her intent clear. She was going to physically escort me out of my own daughter's backyard to remove the problem, to smooth over the social awkwardness. Have you ever been so angry, so utterly betrayed that you suddenly felt perfectly, terrifyingly calm? That was me in that moment. The hurt vanished, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. The game was over. The secret had become a liability, a cancer eating away at my family. It was time to cut it out. Alex saw the change in my eyes. He took a half step forward, ready to intervene, but I gave him a subtle shake of my head. This was my battle to fight. I looked past my daughter, past her sycophantic friends, and fixed my gaze on the French doors leading back into the house. My house, my legacy. I knew what I had to do. The charade of the retired bum was over. I had let her mock me, dismiss me, and try to write me out of my own story. But she had made one fatal error. She had forgotten who wrote the first chapter. I turned away from both my children, my back straight, my purpose solidifying with every step. There was only one thing left to do. In my old guest room upstairs, in the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk Richard had built for me, was a locked metal box. Inside, preserved for 3 decades, were the original incorporation papers for Innovate. And on the founder's line, nestled beside the corporate seal, there was only one name, Rose Carter, mine. The polished oak floorboards were cool beneath my feet as I walked through the house. Each step was a quiet drum beat, marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. The house felt alien to me now, a museum of a life I thought I was building for my family, but which had become a monument to my own foolishness. The shock of Clara's ambition. Her willingness to erase me entirely was a physical blow. It was the icy shiver of truth you feel when you realize the person you love has become a stranger. I could hear their voices from the patio, a low, urgent murmur. Clara was likely explaining away my behavior, spinning a narrative of my decline to her rapt audience. Let her talk. Words were her world. Mine was about to be action. Do you think there's a line a child can cross from which there is no coming back? I reached the guest room, a space Clara had decorated in muted, impersonal grays. It was a room for visitors, not for family. The roll-top desk stood in the corner, a relic of a past she didn't value. My fingers trembled slightly as I knelt and turned the small key in the lock of the bottom drawer. It opened with a soft, familiar click. The metal box was cold to the touch. Inside, nestled in yellow tissue paper were the documents. Not just the incorporation papers, but the original charter, the first-round investor agreements I had negotiated myself, and most importantly, the sealed envelope Richard's lawyer had given me after he passed. It contained his final amendment to our joint will, a fail-safe he had insisted on. Just in case, Rosie, he had said, his voice weak, but his eyes clear. Just in case she forgets who her mother is. I had never opened it. I never thought I would have to. Holding that box felt like holding a grenade. The pin was my secret, and Clara had just handed me a reason to pull it. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and regret. I had wanted her to earn her place, to feel the pride of achievement without the shadow of my name looming over her. I had made myself small so she could feel big. What a catastrophic mistake. As I stood up, the box in my hands, I saw my reflection in the window overlooking the backyard. An older woman, her face etched with lines of worry and love, holding the ghost of her life's work in a tin box. From this vantage point, I could see them clearly. Clara was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear, her movements sharp and agitated. Alex was standing by the gate, his back to her, a solitary, defiant figure. Anna and Leo were whispering to each other, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. They were hyenas circling a wounded lion, and they didn't even know it. My daughter ended her call and strode over to her friends, her gestures emphatic. I couldn't hear her words, but I could read the language of her body. She was powerful, confident, dismissive. She was the queen of this small manicured kingdom, and she had no idea the foundations were about to turn to dust. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing my husband smile one last time. I'm sorry, Richard, I whispered to the empty room. I have to break a promise to keep a promise. I have to save our daughter from herself, even if it means destroying the world she thinks she owns. With the box held tightly against my chest, I walked out of the room. I didn't rush. There was no need. Everything was about to change, and I wanted to savor the final few seconds of the world as Clara knew it. As I descended the stairs, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the grand empty foyer, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from a number I knew by heart. My CEO, the man I had handpicked to run my company until Clara was ready. It was a simple message, a single question. Is it time? I walked toward the French doors, my thumb hovering over the reply. Yes. The moment I stepped back onto the patio, a hush fell over them. It wasn't the same dismissive silence from before. This was a silence thick with tension, with the unspoken question of what I held in my hands. The metal box was not large, but it seemed to occupy all the space in the air. I saw Clara's eyes flick down to it, a flicker of confusion, followed by a wave of irritation. She thought this was another one of my eccentricities, another strange prop in the theater of my supposed decline. The sight of her condescension was like a splash of cold water. The last vestiges of my maternal grief washed away, replaced by the steely resolve that had built an empire. I walked over to the stone table and placed the box down. The sound it made, a solid, definitive thud, was the first shot fired in a war she didn't know we were fighting. "Clara," I began, my voice calm and measured, each word carefully chosen. "You and your friends were discussing Innovate earlier. You seem to believe you understand how the real world works there." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Anna and Leo exchanged a nervous glance. Alex watched me, his expression unreadable, but his posture rigid with anticipation. Clara crossed her arms, a defiant gesture that was meant to project confidence, but only revealed her insecurity. "Mom, what is this? If you're having an episode, maybe you should go lie down. We can talk about this later." "There is no later," I said, my voice dropping. I unlocked the box and lifted the lid. The old papers, yellowed with age, looked fragile, harmless. I took out the original articles of incorporation. I didn't hand them to her. I simply turned them around so she could see the top page. I placed my finger on the signature line, the one written in my own looping cursive 30 years ago. "Rose Carter, founder and chairman of the board," I read aloud. The air crackled. I could physically feel the shift in the atmosphere as the meaning of those words sank in. I saw it in the sudden sharp intake of breath from Anya. I saw it in the way Leo's jaw went slack, his phone forgotten in his hand. But most of all, I saw it in my daughter's face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, pale mask. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from the paper to my face and back again, searching for the trick. The lie, the explanation that would make her world right side up again. That's a fake," she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. "That's impossible. The founder was a man. RC Innovations, a holding company." "RC stands for Rose Carter," I said softly. "I used my initials to give you a chance to build your own reputation, not to stand in my shadow. I wanted you to succeed on your own terms. I wanted you to think you had earned it all yourself." I let the devastating truth of that statement settle over her. The career she was so proud of, the success she used to belittle me, the very company she worked for, it was all a gift. A gift she had just thrown back in my face. Do you think I was too forgiving here, letting her believe a lie for so long? I then took out the second document, the one from Richard's lawyer. "This," I said, holding up the sealed envelope, "is an amendment to your father's will. It contains what is known as the Founders' Clause. A clause your father insisted we include. It states that upon proof of gross personal or professional misconduct by any designated heir acting in an executive capacity," I trailed off looking directly at Clara. "Full and irrevocable control of my majority shares and thus the entire company reverts to me immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. The bird song, the distant hum of traffic, it all faded away into a vacuum of pure shock. Clara was staring at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Her friends were frozen, their faces a perfect tableau of horror. They weren't just watching a family drama unfold. They were watching their careers, their ambitions, their comfortable lives teeter on the edge of a cliff. They had hitched their wagons to a rising star, and they were just now realizing that star was about to be extinguished. And then my son, Alex, did something I never expected. He stepped forward, picked up the articles of incorporation from the table, and read the founders' name aloud one more time, his voice ringing with a fierce, quiet pride. "Rose Carter." He looked at his sister, his eyes full of a sorrow so deep it hurt to see. "She didn't just give you a job, Clara. She gave you everything." The aftermath of a revelation is always quieter than the explosion itself. The world doesn't end with a bang. It ends with the stunned gaping silence of people trying to rebuild reality from the rubble. Clara just stood there, her mouth slightly open, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The sound was thin and fragile in the heavy air. Her carefully constructed universe built on ambition and a sense of earned superiority had been demolished by a single undeniable truth. The bum in the corner was in fact the queen on the throne. Anna and Leo, who moments before had been her loyal court, were now subtly almost imperceptibly distancing themselves. Anna picked up her designer handbag, clutching it like a shield. Leo pocketed his phone, his eyes darting between me and the main gate, clearly calculating the fastest escape route. Their allegiance wasn't to Clara. It was to power. And the balance of power had just shifted with the force of an earthquake. I could feel the cold shiver of their fear from across the patio. They weren't just afraid for their friend. They were terrified for themselves. How many times had they complained about the out-of-ouch board in front of me? How many snide remarks had they made about the company's founding principles, not knowing the founder was passing them the iced tea? Their careers were flashing before their eyes. I don't believe you, Clara finally whispered, the words catching in her throat. It was a pathetic defense, the last desperate denial of a cornered animal. You're lying. You're senile. This is some kind of sick game. Is it? I asked, my voice still quiet. I took my phone out of my pocket and unlocked it. I tapped on the text message I had received earlier. Then I turned the screen so they could all see. It was the reply I had sent to my CEO just before walking out onto the patio. A single word, execute. Before Clara could even process what that meant, her phone began to ring. A shrill, panicked sound that cut through the stillness. She fumbled for it, her hands shaking. The caller ID displayed a name that made her go even paler. David Chen, CEO, Innovate. She stared at it, her thumb hovering over the screen, unable to answer or decline. It rang and rang, a merciless digital summons. At the same time, two more phones began to ring. Anya's and Leo. They looked at their screens, then at each other, their faces identical masks of dread. Their bosses were calling. The chain of command was activating. The order was coming down from the top. My order. What would you have done if your own daughter had tried to steal your life's work? Clara's phone finally went to voicemail, but a second later, it buzzed with a notification. And then another and another. Anya and Leo were getting them, too. The distinct sound of corporate email alerts. I didn't need to see the subject line. I had written it myself an hour ago in a file saved as contingency. Subject: immediate termination of employment. Clara's eyes were locked on her screen, her face crumpling as she read. I watched her posture collapse. The proud, defiant executive dissolving into a lost, broken child. The sheer unadulterated shock on her face was a painful sight, a victory that felt hollow and tragic. She looked up at me, her eyes swimming with a mixture of hatred and a dawning, horrifying understanding. You fired me?" she choked out, the words barely audible. "You fired us?" Anna squeaked from beside her, her voice high with panic. "I didn't just fire you, Clara," I said, my gaze unflinching. "I revoked your access. I froze your corporate accounts. I canceled your company cards. As of 1 minute ago, you are no longer an employee of Innovate. You are a trespasser in a house owned by the company's primary shareholder." I looked at her two friends, my expression hardening. "The same goes for both of you. You have 5 minutes to collect your personal belongings and vacate this property before I call security." Then from the side gate, another sound. A car door slamming. A man in a sharp dark suit walked into the backyard holding a briefcase. It was Arthur Vance, my personal lawyer and the executive of Richard's will. He nodded at me, his face grim and professional. He walked over to the table, opened his briefcase, and placed a thick stack of documents next to my metal box. "Rose," he said, his voice a calm baritone that commanded attention. "Everything is in motion. The board has been notified. The founders' clause has been officially invoked." He then turned his gaze to my daughter, and his expression was devoid of any sympathy. "Clara, a courier is on the way to your office to collect all company property. An injunction has been filed preventing you from making contact with any Innovate employees or clients. You have been formally and legally severed from the company your mother built." The final crushing blow wasn't the lawyer's words. It was the sound of the front door opening. Another man, this one in a simple security uniform, stepped through the house and stood silently by the French doors. His presence a clear and unspoken message. The house was no longer hers. Nothing was. I saw my daughter's betrayal for what it truly was. Not just an insult, but an attempt at complete erasure. She hadn't just mocked me. She had tried to unperson me, to sever me from my own life, my own legacy, and even my own son. And in that moment, seeing the security guard waiting, seeing her friends scrambling to gather their things like frightened mice, seeing the legal papers that acted as the death certificate for her career, I felt the full terrible weight of my own love finally coming home to roost. How can you protect your child from the monster you inadvertently helped create? Anna and Leo were gone in under a minute. A blur of panicked apologies and hasty exits, not even daring to make eye contact with Clara. They abandoned her as quickly and efficiently as she had abandoned me. Then it was just the four of us. Me, the mother who had built the gilded cage, Alex, the son who had watched from the outside, Arthur, the executive of consequences, and Clara, the daughter who had flown too close to a son she never realized I owned. Clara sank into one of the patio chairs. The one I had been sitting in when she called me a bum. It seemed like a lifetime ago. She wasn't crying. Her shock was too deep for tears. She was just staring at the termination email on her phone. Her thumb scrolling up and down, as if rereading it would change the words. I walked over and knelt in front of her the way I used to when she was a little girl with a scraped knee. I took her phone gently from her hand and set it on the table. For the first time, she looked at me, really looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes broke my heart all over again. It wasn't just anger or hatred. It was confusion. It was the desperate, pleading look of a child who had gotten lost in a forest of her own making. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Why would you do this to me?" "I didn't do this to you, Clara," I said, my voice softer than it had been all day. "You did this. You became someone who would mock her own mother for sport. You became someone who would lie to her own brother about her father's will. You became someone who saw family not as a source of love, but as an obstacle to ambition." I stood up, the weariness of the day settling into my bones. I didn't build Innovate to create this person. I built it for the little girl on the swing set who just wanted to touch the sky. I lost her somewhere along the way. Maybe this is how I get her back. I turned to Alex, who had been a silent, powerful witness to it all. He came to my side, his hand resting on my shoulder, a simple gesture of solidarity that meant more than any words. Arthur cleared his throat. "Rose, the security team will remain until the property is fully vacated. She has 24 hours to remove her personal effects." I nodded, not looking at him. My focus was on my daughter. "The company will provide you with a temporary apartment for 6 months. I told her, my voice turning formal again, the voice of the chairman of the board, and a severance, enough to live on while you figure out who you want to be when you don't have Innovate to hide behind." She finally broke. A single hot tear traced a path through her perfect makeup. It wasn't a tear of remorse. Not yet. It was a tear of loss. The loss of power, of status, of a life she thought she had earned. I turned to leave. Alex's hand guiding me. As we reached the gate, I stopped and looked back one last time. My daughter was sitting alone in the middle of a beautiful empty backyard, surrounded by the ruins of a kingdom she had inherited and destroyed in the same day. I had given her everything, and in the end, it was only by taking it all away that I could give her the one thing she truly needed, a chance to find her own humanity. The moral of this story is that a legacy isn't a crown to be worn, but a foundation to be honored. When you forget the people who laid the stones for you to walk on, you risk collapsing the very ground beneath your feet. True strength isn't about rising above others. It's about remembering to lift them up with you. Now, we've all seen families torn apart by ambition. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Clara can ever truly earn back her mother's trust?